The library's secret guardian. Margaret Chen had worked at the downtown public library for 37 years, yet she had never encountered anything quite like this. Every Tuesday at exactly 3:47 p.m., an elderly man would shuffle through the heavy oak doors, make his way to the poetry section, and sit in the same worn leather chair by the window. He never checked out books, never spoke to anyone, and always left precisely at 4:30 p.m. What made him unforgettable wasn't his routine. Libraries attracted creatures of habit. It was the way he read. His weathered fingers would trace each line of poetry as if decoding a sacred text, and tears would silently stream down his cheeks. Always the same book, selected poems of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. For 3 months, Margaret watched this ritual unfold. She'd seen many patrons find solace in books, but something about this man's profound sorrow called to her. There was a story here, one that seemed to be writing itself in the quiet corners of her mind, incomplete and demanding resolution. The mystery deepened when Margaret noticed other peculiar details. The man always sat exactly 43 minutes, never more, never less. He would touch the same page 17 times during each visit, as if performing some sacred ritual. Most intriguingly, he would sometimes whisper to the empty chair beside him, conversations that seemed to require no response yet appeared to bring him comfort. Margaret's colleague, Janet, had noticed too. "That's the poetry man," she said one afternoon while they reorganized returns. "Been coming here since last spring. I heard from Mrs. Davidson that he lost his wife recently. Alzheimer's, poor thing." But Janet's explanation only raised more questions. Why this specific book? Why exactly 43 minutes? And why did he sometimes smile at the empty chair as if someone were sitting there, sharing a private joke? On a particularly gray Tuesday in November, Margaret finally approached him. "Excuse me," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "I've noticed you come here every week. Is there anything I can help you find?" The man looked up, and Margaret was struck by the depth of pain in his pale blue eyes. For a moment, she thought he might speak, but instead, he simply shook his head and returned to his reading. That night, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? Why that specific book? Why did poetry move him to tears? The questions multiplied like library fines, accumulating interest with each passing hour. She found herself researching Elizabeth Barrett Browning, diving deep into the poet's love story with Robert Browning. The more she read, the more she understood. These weren't just poems, they were letters between lovers, declarations of a love so profound it had survived over a century to comfort a grieving widower. The following Tuesday, she tried a different approach. Instead of interrupting his reading, she quietly placed a cup of tea beside his chair, chamomile with honey, the kind that soothes both body and soul. The man looked up, surprised, then nodded his thanks. It was the first acknowledgement of her existence he'd ever given. This became their new routine. Margaret would bring tea, the man would nod his appreciation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigid walls around his sorrow began to soften. Sometimes he would glance at Margaret as she shelved nearby books. Sometimes she would catch him almost smiling when children laughed in the reading corner. But Margaret noticed something else changing. The man's whispered conversations with the empty chair became more animated, as if he were sharing news about his day, including the kindness of the librarian who brought him tea. The realization made Margaret's heart ache with a sweetness she couldn't quite name. One Tuesday, she overheard a fragment of his whispered conversation. "She reminds me of you, Beth. The way she notices things, the way she cares without asking for anything in return." Beth. Elizabeth. The poet's name, and evidently his wife's as well. But it wasn't until the 4th Tuesday of December that everything changed. Margaret arrived that day to find the man waiting by the circulation desk, the poetry book clutched in his trembling hands. For the first time in months, he spoke. Her name was Elizabeth, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife. We were married for 53 years. Margaret felt her heart clench. Suddenly, the pieces of this mysterious ritual began forming a picture she wasn't prepared to see. "She died 8 months ago," he continued, his voice breaking. "Alzheimer's. She forgot everything, our wedding day, our children's names, my face. But until the very end, she remembered poetry. These poems. He opened the book to a dog-eared page, and Margaret saw handwritten notes in the margins, a woman's delicate handwriting alongside a man's stronger script. We used to read to each other every evening, he said. When she got sick, it was the only thing that still reached her. Even when she couldn't remember my name, she would finish the lines I started. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. Margaret found herself crying, though she couldn't remember when the tears had started. I come here because home is too quiet now, he admitted. But reading her favorite poems, it's like she's still with me, just for those 43 minutes every week. 43 minutes, Margaret repeated softly. Harold nodded, understanding her question without it being asked. That's how long our evening reading sessions lasted. She timed them once, said it was the perfect length for the heart to fill up with beauty without overflowing. If you've ever felt the weight of loss transform into something unexpectedly beautiful, you'll understand what happened next. Share this story if you believe that love finds ways to endure beyond memory itself. Margaret realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just grief, but love in its purest form. Love that transcended memory, love that lived in the spaces between words, love that could be found in a worn library chair every Tuesday afternoon. Would you like to tell me about her? Margaret asked gently. And so began the most beautiful friendship of Margaret's 37-year career. Each Tuesday, after the tea and the poetry, Harold, for that was his name, would share stories about Elizabeth. How she taught third grade for 40 years and knew every student's name decades later. How she made him laugh even during their worst arguments. How she insisted on dancing in the kitchen while cooking dinner, flower in her hair and music in her heart. Harold told Margaret about Elizabeth's peculiar habits, how she would leave love notes in his lunch box even after retirement, how she collected vintage teacups but only used her favorite chipped one, how she would read the endings of mystery novels first because she claimed suspense gave her indigestion. Margaret began looking forward to Tuesdays with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. Harold's stories were filling a loneliness she hadn't even realized she carried. As a lifelong bachelor who had devoted herself entirely to books and patrons, she had convinced herself that solitude was enough. But Harold's stories about partnership, about having someone who knew your heart so well they could finish your sentences, made her realize what she had missed. But there was something Harold wasn't telling her. Margaret could sense it in the way his voice would catch when he mentioned certain dates, in how he would sometimes stare out the window with an expression of desperate urgency. There were gaps in his stories, moments when he would stop mid-sentence and change the subject, as if approaching territory too dangerous to explore. The answer came on the first Tuesday of March. Harold didn't show up. Margaret waited by the window, tea growing cold, anxiety building with each passing minute. At 4:45 p.m., she called the number on his library card, something she had never done for any patron, but Harold had become more than a patron. He had become family. A woman answered, her voice thick with exhaustion. I'm calling about Harold Peterson, Margaret said. I'm Margaret, from the library. Oh, the woman said, and Margaret could hear the relief in her voice. Oh, you're Margaret. Dad talks about you all the time. I'm Sarah, his daughter. Is he all right? He didn't come in today. There was a long pause, and Margaret's heart began to race. He's in the hospital, Sarah said finally. They think it might be a stroke. But Margaret, he's been asking for you. He says there's something important he needs to tell you before. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like morning fog. Margaret was at the hospital within 20 minutes, the poetry book tucked under her arm. She found Harold in room 314, looking smaller and frilier than she had ever seen him, but his eyes lit up when she entered. Margaret, he whispered, reaching for her hand. I was afraid I'd run out of time. Time for what, Harold? He smiled, that gentle smile she had grown to love over their months of Tuesday conversations. To tell you about the letters, he said. What letters? Harold's grip tightened on her hand. Elizabeth wrote me letters. Every day of our marriage, even after the Alzheimer's started. Hidden them all over the house, in books, in coat pockets, in coffee cans. I've been finding them since she died. Margaret felt that familiar curiosity gap opening, that need to know more. Yesterday, I found one addressed to the kind woman at the library, Harold continued. She wrote it 3 years ago, back when her memory was getting bad, but she still had moments of clarity. Somehow, she knew. She knew there would be someone like you. With shaking hands, Harold reached into his hospital gown and pulled out a sealed envelope. Margaret's name was written on it in the same delicate handwriting she had seen in the poetry book. What did Elizabeth's letter say? The answer will restore your faith in the connections that bind us across time and space. Keep reading to discover how love can reach across the impossible. Margaret opened the letter with trembling fingers. Dear kind woman at the library. I don't know your name, but I know you exist. I can feel you in the future, caring for my Harold when I no longer can. Thank you for the tea. Yes, I know about the tea. I know about the gentle way you listen to his stories. I know about the patience you show an old man who needs to cry over poetry. Harold thinks he comes to the library to remember me, but that's not why. He comes because his heart knows what his mind doesn't yet understand, that there are different kinds of love, and the love between friends who share sorrow and healing is just as sacred as the love between spouses. I'm not jealous of the affection growing between you. I'm grateful for it. Love multiplies, it doesn't divide. The kindness you show my husband doesn't take anything away from what we had. It adds to it. Please don't let him stop living when I stop breathing. Help him remember that a heart that has loved deeply still has room for new forms of joy. Tuesday teas can become Wednesday dinners, poetry readings can become evening walks, and two people who understand loss can become two people who understand each other. Thank you for proving that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they have library cards. With all my love and gratitude, Elizabeth Peterson. P.S. Harold's favorite meal is spaghetti carbonara, but he hasn't cooked it since I got sick. The recipe is tucked inside his copy of Robert Frost's poems on the shelf at home. He'll try to say he's not hungry, but he always is. Margaret looked up through her tears to find Harold watching her with an expression of hopeful uncertainty. She was right, wasn't she? He asked softly. About the tea, about everything. Margaret squeezed his hand. She was extraordinary. She was, Harold agreed. And she would have liked you very much. She would have said you have a heart like hers, big enough for everyone's stories. 3 weeks later, Harold was back in his Tuesday chair, still reading poetry, still honoring Elizabeth's memory. But now Margaret sat with him sometimes, and they would read aloud together. Harold's tears still came, but they were different now, less about unbearable loss, more about overwhelming gratitude. The empty chair beside Harold was no longer empty. Margaret had quietly moved a second chair from the reference section, and now their Tuesday ritual included 2 cups of tea, shared stories, and the gentle companionship of 2 souls who had found each other in the most unexpected way. If this story moved you, imagine how your own small acts of kindness might be creating stories you'll never know about. Share this reminder that we are all part of each other's unfinished chapters. On a warm evening in May, Margaret cooked spaghetti carbonara in Harold's kitchen while he read Elizabeth's letters aloud. Some were funny, some were heartbreaking, all were love letters to life itself. As they ate dinner by the window where Elizabeth used to watch birds, Margaret realized that Elizabeth had been right about more than the recipe for pasta. Love does multiply rather than divide. The friendship growing between Harold and Margaret didn't diminish what he had shared with his wife, it honored it. Elizabeth's love had been so vast, so generous, that it had reached beyond her own mortality to orchestrate this moment, this meal, this healing. The library still sees them every Tuesday at 3:47 p.m. But now they bring 2 cups of tea, and sometimes other patrons join them. The Poetry Corner has become a gathering place for people who understand that literature isn't just about words on a page, it's about the connections that save us when we think we're too broken to be saved. Margaret often thinks about the mysterious ways love works, how Elizabeth's final gift wasn't just a letter, but the understanding that some stories don't end with death. They just change narrators. And every Tuesday, in a worn leather chair by the library window, two friends continue a love story that began with one woman's grief and another woman's kindness, proving that the most beautiful chapters are often the ones we never saw coming. Your turn. What story is waiting to be written in the quiet corners of your own life? Share this if you believe that every ending can become a new beginning when witnessed with love. The deeper meaning, understanding the human heart through story. This story resonates so deeply because it touches the universal threads that connect us all: loss, loneliness, kindness, and the profound human need for connection. But what makes it truly powerful isn't just what happens on the surface, it's what it reveals about the hidden depths of human experience. The psychology of grief and healing. Harold's Tuesday ritual represents something we all do when facing loss. We create sacred spaces where memory and present reality can coexist. His 43-minute sessions weren't just about reading poetry, they were about maintaining a connection that death couldn't sever. This reflects the healthy side of grief, where we learn to carry our loved ones with us rather than trying to forget them. Margaret's recognition of Harold's pain speaks to our innate ability to sense suffering in others, even when it's carefully hidden. Her decision to offer tea without asking questions demonstrates emotional intelligence at its finest, understanding that sometimes presence matters more than words, and kindness requires no justification. The ripple effect of small acts. What's remarkable about this story is how one small gesture, a cup of tea, created a cascade of healing that extended far beyond two people. Elizabeth's letter reveals the profound truth that love doesn't end with death, it transforms and continues through the kindness of strangers who become friends. This reflects real psychological research showing that acts of kindness release oxytocin and endorphins, creating what scientists call helper's high. But more importantly, it demonstrates how compassion multiplies. Margaret's kindness to Harold didn't diminish her capacity for caring, it expanded it. The universal language of human connection. Libraries aren't just repositories of books, they're sanctuaries for the human spirit. They represent neutral ground where all stories are welcome, where silence is respected, and where the act of reading connects us to the vast human experience. Margaret and Harold found each other in this space because both understood that some hungers, for understanding, for connection, for meaning, can only be satisfied through genuine human contact. Think about these questions as you process this story. They're designed to help you explore your own experiences with kindness, loss, and connection. The beauty of this story lies not just in its emotional impact, but in its invitation to examine our own capacity for noticing, caring, and connecting. Every day, we encounter people carrying invisible burdens, fighting private battles, hoping for small signs that they matter to someone. Margaret's gift wasn't just the tea or the meal money, it was her willingness to see Harold as a complete person worthy of care, regardless of his circumstances. In a world that often moves too fast for such attention, this story reminds us that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest gestures. Your story is still being written. Whose chapter might be waiting for your kindness to help it continue?